Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to start the discussion. Human rights violations in Belarus, what can we change and how? We have an amazing, very, very solid panel representing different countries, different institutions. I hope that not that different perspectives in terms of human rights and democracy, but I think that every one of us is able to highlight or to some of his or her perspectives regarding what can we change in terms of the human rights violations in Belarus, what could international community do, what could the NGO community do, and what could every individual, no matter which country, do, or how to contribute to the change or to the human rights and democracy situation in Belarus. It's not an easy question and far from theoretical one, because we know that the protests in Belarus are continuing. They are massive. The human rights violations and the repressions of the authorities are massive too. And it's a big challenge for the neighboring countries, for the Euro-Atlantic community, for the international institutions as well. We have received a lot of resolutions, like we have seen a lot of resolutions, we have seen a lot of speeches, tweets regarding solidarity with the Belarusian people. We have seen financial contributions to the civil society. We have seen even attempts of pressure, introducing sanctions to those who are the perpetrators or those who participated and falsified, participated in the repressions or falsified the elections on the 9th of August. So it's a difficult situation, and there are already a couple of results. One, which is the OSCE Moscow Mechanism, which was launched, and I hope that we'll have Professor Benedek to speak about that. There was another institution, there is another institution, which is United Nations, and there's a Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Belarus, Anaïs Marin, who is also with us here and has done a number of reports regarding the human rights situation in Belarus, and she's going to speak about that in a bit. We have also Enira Bronitskaya, who is the Belarusian human rights defender, works a lot on investigation of the torture cases in Belarus. She has also participated a number of times in various international election observation missions, so she can share her perspective regarding how she sees the election process and what can international community do in terms of ensuring that the next elections in Belarus are free and fair. We have Ambassador Leslie Scanlon, Ambassador of Canada to Poland and Belarus, one of the countries which is very outspoken about the human rights violations in Belarus and very supportive to the Belarusian civil society. So I would like to hear your perspective as well. And last but not least, Dainius Žalimas, chair of Lithuanian Constitutional Court. I hope that and expect that he will provide us with a sober perspective in terms of what's possible under the international law and where the international law ends and realpolitik starts. So very diverse, very enriching discussion as I envision it. And I suggest kicking off with the 3 to 5 minutes speeches by every panelist, and we'll go to a Q&A session right afterwards, after that, to make sure that it's an interactive exchange of the ideas. I am also asked by the organizers to mention that the audience here might expect a couple of prizes if they are going to answer to one question regarding Belarus and human rights situation. That question will be raised at the end of our discussion, and there are 3 prizes for those who are going to be the first to answer that correctly. The discussion is going to be in English, but there's an interpretation, and those who are going to use that, they can see an icon at the very bottom of the Zoom page, marked by the interpretation. So, but the entire discussion is going to be in English. So without further ado, I see that Professor Benedek is here. So let me start with you, Professor, and hear from you in terms of how do you see the OSCE work and Moscow mechanism in particular? Like, it has been a challenging task for you to collect and prepare the report within a couple of weeks, and yet you managed, and I am hearing very positive remarks from the human rights defenders, but and it's not your first time engaging with the OSCE on that matter. So please, Professor, please share a couple of thoughts regarding what can we change and how in terms of human rights violations in Belarus.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today on Human Rights Day. I understand that I should say a couple of words on the OSCE process and also the reaction, international reaction to it. And here I can say that for the OSCE, it's not very frequent that the Moscow mechanism is being used. Actually, we have had a case with Belarus already more than 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago. Since that time, there were only 2 major cases. One was Chechnya, in which I also had the opportunity to act as rapporteur 2 years ago, and this time on Belarus. Belarus is in this sense similar to previous cases as regards the lack of cooperation from the country in question. Unfortunately, in spite of the obligation under the Moscow mechanism and also my kind request, there was no cooperation from the Belarusian authorities, which did not prevent them, and also the Russian delegation later on to blame the report as being one-sided and not being informed enough from the side of the information which the Belarusian government could have provided. Unfortunately, they did not do so. Nonetheless, with the help of a number of Belarusian NGOs, international NGOs, I was able to do a substantive report. And also I would like to mention the many communications I have received from individuals during this process, which confirmed what was already available through the reports of major human rights organizations in the country. Now, what is also a bit different from the last report I did on Chechnya is that there was a very strong interest in my report and also a strong reception of it by various fora. So in the recent 2 weeks, I had presentations at the United Nations General Assembly in a side event. I had the opportunity to present it to the European Parliament, to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and also in other fora, and more is coming, like another meeting with the Council of the European Union only next week. So what I see here is a very strong interest from the international community, which use my report as a sort of catalytic element in their dealings with the situation in Belarus. Certainly this information more or less is in the public area anyway, so it is not something surprising or something which could not be known anyway. But I think what was needed was to provide this information in a comprehensive way, and also to check from various sources whether this information was reliable. Now it is in the air, it is available, and as you rightly say, the question now is what will be done with it, what is coming out of it. And I really have on my mind the many people who sent me their testimonies of their ill treatment, and who rightfully were expecting that this would have some effect. And what I see so far is that there is an effect in the sense of awareness raising. There's an effect in the sense of discussing and also elaborating ways how to deal with the situation by various international and other organizations, actors. And in particular, there is a process ongoing regarding one of my main recommendations, namely the establishment of an independent international investigation body or mechanism, which should produce a database with high quality information on the violations, so that this could be used directly in court, both in national courts under the universal jurisdiction, and also in possible future international procedures. And here I see that the process is advancing. This is a question also of a coordination of efforts, because there are a number of good efforts which have been undertaken in various places. In Lithuania also needs to be highlighted. And all these good efforts need to be brought together into a joint effort in order to make it as effective as possible. So there is a need of coordination in this respect, and I hope that the actors, various actors, will go for such a coordination, because one thing is a common understanding of everybody heard and to every fora I have been talking to, and this is that justice needs to be done. There needs to be accountability for what is happening, and that it is not acceptable to have impunity for these ill treatment, violations, torture, and major human rights violations which have happened so far. So let me stop here at the moment, and then I will be available later on if you want.
Thank you, Professor. Indeed, like I can only reiterate that the speed of the OSCE Moscow Mechanism, I think it was incredible. Compared to the Chechnya case, I think that it was faster, and it's indeed a very comprehensive report. So it gives quite a lot of positive thoughts regarding that. Well, in fact, those who claim that international institutions are ineffective and that would be a counter argument saying, well, you know, it's a rarely used mechanism and yet it was launched. And I think it goes to the argument that there's a very strong and high interest by the international community to somehow contribute and solve this human rights crisis in Belarus. But when we talk about the international law, usually we look into the highest international body, this is like United Nations. And we have Anaïs here, a good friend of mine, a scholar and academic, a representative of the expert community, who is working also as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Belarus. And she is also not allowed to travel into Belarus, as far as I recall, which shows actually the attitude of the official Minsk. Anaïs, please share a couple of thoughts on the matter with the audience.
With pleasure. Thank you, Vytis. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this event. So indeed, there are many institutions in the UN, and the mandate that I've been holding for the past 2 years is only but one mechanism, and I'm afraid it's the only one I am allowed to speak about. And because as an independent expert, I'm not a UN staff, and among the many criticisms that the UN the Human Rights Council has received recently was the fact that when I was speaking in the media, for example, it looked like I was expressing the voice of the UN, which is not the case. Pursuant of the resolution that established my mandate in 2012, and this resolution is being renewed each year, my duties here with regards to monitoring the situation of human rights in Belarus are fivefold. So I will remind them because I think it's important. First, as part of this monitoring, I have to make recommendations for improving the situation. This year, especially since August, my main recommendation to the international community was, of course, to pay attention to the humanitarian aspects of the following the crackdown on peaceful protesters. And I can only repeat this because from what I see with the waves of refugees and given the deep psychological trauma experienced by victims of human rights violations, I think it is very important to keep up efforts in this direction. And Lithuania is among the good examples for that matter, providing much needed assistance. Yet the main addressee of my recommendations is the government of Belarus, which unfortunately continues its policy of non-recognition of my mandate and non-engagement. This makes it impossible for me to fulfill the second mission that mandate holders are tasked with implementing, that is, to assist the government in fulfilling its human rights obligations. I regularly call the government to implement past recommendations, to launch much delayed systemic reforms, and since the spring, I also repeatedly called the authorities to end violence, to release those detained for expressing their dissenting views, and also for engaging in a dialogue with civil society. To no avail so far, as you have noticed, because indeed the government doesn't recognize the mandate. The third element, and the biggest one I would say, is to report annually to the Human Rights Council in the summer session and to the General Assembly in the autumn. The report to the Human Rights Council is traditionally an overview of the situation in all relevant fields to human rights. So that includes civil and political rights, social, economic, and cultural rights. And this year's report addressed these issues with a focus on discriminations. The report to the General Assembly is usually more of a thematic report, which focuses on one specific, systemic, long-term issue, which I find relevant based on my own observations. And as you recalled, I have been working on Belarus for over a decade now, so I think I know a bit the topic. My first report last year was dedicated to human rights violations during electoral processes. It highlighted why, given the fact that nothing had changed in law and in practice to make elections in Belarus compliant with standards for genuine, free and fair elections, the current cycle, which started with legislative elections 1 year ago, could hardly lead to cleaner elections than had been the case in the past. Unfortunately, events proved me right. As for this year's report, its focus was on the administration of justice and the penitentiary system. again, with restrictions, since I am not granted access to the country, I have no chance of verifying the numerous allegations of ill treatment in prisons, notably. And I look forward to somebody from the international community being allowed to get in Belarusian prison to assess the situation there, because again, it's a systemic problem. So it highlighted again systemic problems such as the excessive control of the executive branch on the judiciary, restrictions on the independence of procurers, judges and lawyers, as well as worrying practices such as contempt for the principles of right to a fair trial and presumption of innocence. And upon presenting that report to the General Assembly on 26th of October, I insisted on the latest developments in the judiciary field, and notably the worrying practice of impunity for perpetrators of serious crimes, disproportionate violence, torture, and forced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. And also I stressed the problem with the lack of access to redress mechanisms for victims of torture. To date, let me remind that almost 2,000 complaints for abusive violence, torture, and ill treatment have been reported. That includes rapes, cruel treatment, psychological violence by way of intimidation. In these, I count also the threat to deprive protesters of their custodial rights over their underage children, which I was happy to see also made its way into Professor Benedek's report, because it is indeed a very serious problem. But to my knowledge, no judicial investigation has been launched so far into these crimes. Fourth, I may offer support and advice to civil society. This is what I am indirectly doing by participating in panels such as today's at expert conferences or through media, including social media, on Facebook, for example. Since August, I gave some 100 interviews or speeches. And in addition, the mandate holder traditionally meets with human rights defenders and representatives of civil society organizations abroad once a year, to discuss key problems and strategize cooperation for the coming year. This replaces the yearly visit, which, pursuant of the resolution, I would be doing in Belarus if the government recognized the mandate. So being based in Warsaw, I regularly have an opportunity to also meet with civil society activists or even now refugees and victims of human rights violations among them. But here I must remind of a strict limitation of my prerogatives due to the UN Code of Conduct for Special Procedures mandate holders, which demands that we respect the principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and objectivity, but also that we refrain from politicization, meaning that I'm not allowed to engage with the political opposition. Although I can consider they are part of civil society, however, meeting with, for example, members of the Consultative Council in exile here in Warsaw would be seen by the authorities and their numerous supporters in the UN, here the numbers are much bigger than within the OSCE, as breaching the Code of Conduct. And finally, I can seek, receive, examine, and act on information from all relevant stakeholders. And this is what my staff in Geneva and myself are doing on a daily basis. And now the work has been multiplied by 10 since August. So the first thing we do upon receiving such information or allegations of human rights violations is to cross-check, double-check, triple-check the data provided. Historical human rights defending organizations such as Vyasna help us fulfill that task. And in addition, the OHCHR can occasionally request assistance from the senior human rights officer in Minsk, but I am not entitled to communicate directly with him because he's recognized by the authorities, I'm not. And following up on these verifications, one of the actions we can launch is to send what we call an allegation letter to the government. And this proved to be quite effective for several reasons. Traditionally, the government of Belarus replies to allegation letters because it wants to be seen as cooperating with the UN system. But it does so only when the letters are co-authored by thematic mandates, because then it can reply to them, not to me. So that's the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the working group on arbitrary detentions, etc. So it is good because it forces the government to justify itself for its actions or lack thereof. And also it contributes to disseminating knowledge within the Belarusian administration about international human rights law standards that we remind in Annex, all the applicable conventions and norms. Because all the bureaucrats concerned, depending on the rights which is being violated, have to brainstorm inside the government, inside various administrations. The head of a prison can have to explain why was someone denied access to his lawyer or access to education, for example, for minors. So it has a pedagogical purpose, I would say. And it also gives the problems and the actions of the mandate extra public visibility, which can be lacking otherwise, because the issuance of an allegation letter is usually followed by a press release. And by the way, only in exceptional circumstances are special rapporteurs allowed to issue a press statement without sending a prior allegation letter. And when there is, for example, a high risk of further violations. And this is what we did on the 19th of November, and which was apparently the last straw on the camel's back for officials in Minsk. It was met by strong protests. They accused us of violating the code of conduct, not giving them a chance to reply before going public about, that was about allegations of torture and also following the assassination of Roman Bondarenko. In response, the government threatened to publicly repudiate all special procedures mandate holders that collaborate with me, as if they ever collaborated with them in the first place. In practice, and although we were afraid of possible retaliation for the victims themselves, allegation letters have contributed to improving the fate of several individuals so far. Those who consented to have their names mentioned in the allegation letter, it's not always the case. This was the case, for example, for the children 3 to 8, which was my focus last year. These minors detained for long prison terms, up to 10 years for minor crime-related, drug-related crimes. Also in the case of foreigners who have been targeted by expeditious expulsion procedures, again for minor offenses. People who had been living in Belarus for decades, have children there, were threatened to leave the country and not being able to come back for several years. And in that case, apparently it helped them. One of them even thanked me for not, because he was considering committing suicide. And so he thanked me after his sentence was lifted. And also it apparently contributed to the early release of some bloggers and journalists back in the spring, but not all of them, however. What more could be done? Following up on the urgent debate at the Human Rights Council on the 18th of September, the High Commissioner, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, was tasked with drafting a report due to the next session in March. And meanwhile, she presented an oral update on the 4th of December, which was followed by an interactive dialogue, but no further resolution in terms of what else could be launched, an independent fact-finding mission or something like this. And following up on an ARIA format meeting that was held on 4th of September at the UN Security Council, there have been, from what I know, meetings behind closed doors at the Security Council. There is no transparency as to what was said there, and I am not informed about it. From what I know, only the Security Council would be competent to decide on sanctions against the government or to decide on the establishment of an international criminal court for prosecuting torture crimes or possibly crimes against humanity. But here, as you know, the composition of the Permanent Council with Russia and China having veto rights probably makes it impossible. I apologize for having been a bit long, and I look forward to the discussion in case you want more from me.
Yes. Thank you very much. Indeed, so we have OSCE, we have the UN Human Rights Council, we have the Security Council area formula, We have also some meetings conducted at the Council of Europe, though Belarus is not a member of the Council of Europe, mainly because it's still the only country which has the death penalty in Europe. There were also multiple hearings at the European Parliament, also at different national parliaments in France, Bundestag, and there were like meetings with the Belarusian Democrats and the leadership of various countries, prime ministers, ministers. So definitely there's a very high interest and solidarity. And yet the situation, and don't make mistake, human rights situation in Belarus is pretty bad for quite some time, but now we are talking about crisis when we have more than 30,000 people who are oppressed, tens of thousands fleeing the country, hundreds tortured, wounded, some even killed. And I wanted to ask Enira Bronitskaya, as the Belarusian human rights, I personally wouldn't have expected such a big reaction by international community, and yet I can imagine that being like Belarusian, you might feel that this is still not enough. Enira, please.
Thank you, first of all, and good afternoon. It just, I don't know, I mean, being in Belarus, I still want to start just with a couple of words about what's going on now, just really one sentence. And I mean, positively, we are still protesting. And I think this is something that is inspiring everyone here. And I hope that outside of this country, especially those who already unfortunately left this country. But unfortunately, negatively, authorities are still continue their repressions, and their repressions are widening, and their repression starts to be more strict. I mean, today people can be arrested or fined just for displaying flag in the window, because this will be treated as single picket. Person can be searched and the property can be confiscated for being suspected in minor offense, actually for being suspected in participating in unauthorized rally. This week, 5 persons were convicted for drawing on asphalt we will not forget. And one of those was convicted for 2 years of imprisonment in strict prison. Woman received 2.5 years of imprisonment for turn off balaclava from the face of law enforcement officer. And this all that we are still facing, and for this moment we don't see the end of this. We don't know what will be tomorrow. So in a way, when someone will ask me whether it's enough or not enough actions in response to what is happening, I can't say what needs to be done. I mean, I'm happy to discuss this, but still it's not enough, because this is continuous and the repressions are starting to be harder. And again, I mean, all this is happening on a background of thousands of cases of tortures and inhuman treatment that was mentioned today several times. And I mean, we already lost the hope that these cases will be investigated by these authorities. It's already, I would say, proved that authorities acknowledge that they will not investigate. More and more people are receiving responses that the criminal cases will not be opened on their complaints, and people afraid to submit new complaints because the criminal cases are opened back on these people. And here it's very, I mean, we are highly supporting the idea of creating any international investigation organization, committee, whatever type it will be called, because for this today, we don't hope that it will be investigated here. And at the same time, people are losing their hope, because we need to tell them why we want them to tell their stories. And at the same time, it's very clear that if we will not collect this information about what happened to people today here, it will be never investigated at any stage. And it's for us, for human rights defenders today, it's more and more complicated to persuade people to we are documenting tortures, and we are conducted deep interviews that is taken up to 3 hours sometimes, and sometimes it's really complicated to persuade people to talk to us. We are trying to explain why we need to collect it, and I mean, we are trying to say that it's really necessary, maybe not today, but if we will not document it as we are doing this, you will never be, this justice will never, will never reach the justice. And I mean, this is also something that international community could contribute in, first of all, even in motivating people to continue speaking to human rights defenders and to continue trying to save as much documents as they have. I mean, for like, this is something that we need to do, and we still hope that one day we will have this mechanism. Just a couple of words, I don't know, like about elections. It's just very important to notice, I think, that Belarus still protesting peacefully. I think that every day our authorities trying to push us for something violent, but we are, it's decision, and I'm happy that we are following this decision. And the demand, the joint demand of Belarus protesters are new elections. And I'm happy that this is the demand, and of course this demand need to be supported by any means, by all community that that is supporting Belarus today and democracy in this country, because and in fact it's not that complicated. That's only that I want to say, because I mean, we don't need to change the legislation. Recently, Office of Tikhanovskaya made a statement, and I mean, in a way, I supported this statement, contributed with some of my expertise, because we have more or less legislation. Of course, it's not perfect, but it is suitable for conducting of adequate elections, but of course, political will is required.
Thank you, Enira. I mean,
And just sorry, Vytis, but last moment, I mean, today it became aware that from 21st December, Belarus will close its borders for departure also for Belarus citizens. That means that actually those who were in danger here and were fleeing, like by ground border, from 21st December, it will be really complicated, because we will be able to leave our country only by plane.
Yes, I mean, I agree. It's terrifying, and yet, I mean, I love to see you like smiling and not giving up. On the other hand, I'm reading the situation when it was announced that the victims of the repression and generally the Belarusian population are not going to be allowed to leave the country, allegedly because of the COVID restrictions. The way I'm reading it, it's basically the attempt by the regime to seed fear, so that people, those who are active, those who were participating in the protests, are leaving immediately, and thus the Belarusian authorities will expect to have a little bit more calm situation during Christmas. But that's another aspect, and I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A session. I'm also encouraging the audience to write down the questions, raise them to anyone, like directly or generally to the entire group. Lithuania has initiated the process of the universal jurisdiction when one of the victims who was severely beaten filed a complaint and started the case in Lithuania towards the Belarusian authorities. And that's an interesting, again, a pretty rare instrument. it's gonna be a very, very long endeavor, but I would really like to hear from Dainius Žalimas, who's the chair of Lithuanian Constitutional Court, in terms of, like, we've heard a lot of international mechanisms which were used or which were attempted to use. Belarus is still ignoring international standards. So what does it say about us? Like, do we have some extra moves to make sure that we do protect human rights and democracy in Belarus?
Thank you very much indeed. But just before saying a few words about possible mechanism or possible instruments that can be used by international community, instruments indeed, I would like to say a few words about how I do see in general the situation in Belarus in the law enforcement sphere. Indeed, why I became familiar with the Belarusian situation, one of the reasons being in my office, I was always following the developments of constitutional justice and constitutional courts in foreign states. And of course, it's a pity, but I have to note that there are two constitutional courts in Europe who were used as a tool for commission of international crimes. One of them we know very well from 2014, that is the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation, who just took part in the commission of the crime of aggression by justifying aggression or annexation of Crimea committed by the Russian Federation. And the next this is the Constitutional Court of Belarus, and I think the example of the Constitutional Court of Belarus is one of the best examples and also demonstrating the uniqueness of the situation in Belarus, because after the famous act adopted by the Belarusian Constitutional Court on 25th, if I remember, August of this year, we can speak about the full discreditation of judicial authority in Belarus, actually about the absence of any judicial authority in Belarus. Why I came to this conclusion, the fact is very simple. The Belarus Constitutional Court just adopted the act, which is not foreseen neither by the Belarus constitution nor by any law of Belarus. That's also demonstrates about uniqueness of the situation. We all remember the times of the Soviet occupation. At least in the Soviet occupation, all the so-called judicial authorities, they tried to use, I don't know, the existing legislation in order to, what to say, to mask or to justify their activities. But in case of the Belarus Constitutional Court, it is an apparent example that this court exceeded all the powers granted to it by the Belarus Constitution and by legislation of the Belarus, because there is nothing in the Constitution or in any law of Belarus that the Constitutional Court of Belarus can adopt decisions on the following issues, like, first of all, a confirmation of electoral results, because the Belarus Constitutional Court just proclaimed about legitimacy of the presidential elections. And the second thing, it is also not granted any competence to proclaim about unconstitutionality of any association. And the Constitutional Court of Belarus proclaimed that the Coordination Council is allegedly unconstitutional body, and totally ignoring even the text of the constitution, because the text of the Belarus constitution quite paradoxically also provides that their international commitments or the international obligations in human rights sphere must be followed by Belarus. And that means the only thing that you can proclaim any association as unconstitutional in accordance with international standards. One of the international standards is simply necessity in a democratic society. And it is very clear, and it is only logical that the Coordination Council, which actually pursues the only thing to achieve fair elections, cannot be called something unconstitutional or anti-democratic. On the contrary, it pursues the goal which is completely consistent with democracy and actually to restore democratic order and the rule of law. But after this ruling, or the position, actually the act was called position, which is also not foreseen, this form of act is also not foreseen neither by the constitution nor by any law of the Belarus Republic, we may see that actually there is no judicial authority in Belarus which is capable to not only to investigate the crimes or human rights violation, but which is not capable even to ensure law enforcement and even I always also use this expression that impartiality and independence is something inherent elements in the concept of judicial authorities or in the concept of the court. So we can for 100% be sure that currently there is no judicial authority in Belarus, neither constitutional court nor the Supreme Court nor any ordinary court can be named as a court at all, because we can see that all the judicial authority is used only as a measure to prosecute or to persecute people who are simply expressing their disappointment and their disagreement with the behavior of authorities. And that leads me to further thought that, you know, in this situation, I think in future it is inevitable that in order to make somebody or accountable for their ongoing human rights violations and ongoing crimes, we can speak about the of course it's subject to further investigation, but we can speak that there is a ground to believe that now in Belarus we can see such crimes against humanity as massive torture, as forced disappearance, as massive persecution of populations on political grounds. So I think in future it is inevitable that some kind of international jurisdiction should be involved in setting this issue of accountability for human rights violations. And unfortunately, now we don't have any effective tools to stop immediately those ongoing human rights violations or ongoing crimes. But nevertheless, as by previous speakers already, as they noted, we have international mechanisms simply to collect reliable, impartial and objective information on the crimes committed, and to use them in future should we have any effective international jurisdiction. But of course, before establishment of any international tribunal, I don't know, it's of course first of all political decision whether the currently existing international tribunal like International Criminal Court could be used, or where in future any specific ad hoc international tribunal can be established. But anyway, I think the first precondition for establishment of any such international tribunal, just to be very simple, the key of future settlement of the issue of accountability for human rights violations, first of all, belongs to the Belarusian people themselves. We can support their fight for democracy, for human rights, but only they can establish or re-establish the rule of law in Belarus, and then address international community for any possible assistance to ensure effective law enforcement in Belarus, because now I don't know even what to recommend. I think the uniqueness of the situation is simply that because of the current absence of any law enforcement authorities, of any judicial authorities in Belarus, the Belarus society in future will need to rebuild everything anew, to find and to recruit new lawyers, new judges, new policemen, and for that I think in future international assistance will be inevitable. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I saw Enira nodding the head, so to renew all the judicial framework. I'm no lawyer, but as a political scientist, what I've heard, if the state judicial institutions fail, you know, we need some international mechanisms to replace them. And yet, and there's already a question from the audience about the non-interference into domestic affairs. We are hearing from the Belarusian authorities that don't interfere into domestic affairs pretty often. And yet they were the ones who signed the international conventions and all of that. So, you know, international law, we need to also admit that this is a consequence of the political agreements between different states. And Canada, as no other country, I think, is the proponent of the democracy, human rights, and does a lot worldwide, but also in Belarus. So without further ado, Ambassador Leslie Scanlon, please, your take on what's happening in Canada, what's Canada doing, what it's thinking to do. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I must say it's really something to be on this panel with all these experts. As some of you know, we didn't even have a full-time officer focusing on Belarus from Warsaw, where we cover Belarus. So we've had quite a learning curve that's been quite speedy. And I did want to say that I was very struck by Professor Benedek saying that justice must be done. And I think that is a driving motivation for all of us who are out here watching what's happening. I did also want to say that I'm one member of a very large team back at headquarters, programmers, and we have a fantastic office in Vilnius with whom we work as well. So we're very involved with various entities. And I did want to say that because I'm going to read what I want to say because I wanted to cover off comments from various different people. I did want to note, of course, it's already been mentioned, today is Human Rights Day, and it also marks the conclusion of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And this is a chance for us to remember again and recognize the women on the front lines of Belarusian democracy movement who have been subjected to acts of sexual and gender-based violence. The systemic nature and scale of violations by the Belarusian authorities following the presidential elections, which continue today with impunity, are deeply disturbing and unacceptable, as has been said by so many of us. Canada has been intensely engaged in response to the events in Belarus since the beginning of the crisis. Together with our partners, we have declared that Alexander Lukashenko lacks the legitimacy to lead Belarus and combined our efforts to support the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian people. Canada pressed for the Moscow Mechanism to be invoked because of our serious concerns over the fraudulent elections and the violent repression that followed. We again thank Professor Benedek for his evidence-based reporting that unambiguously confirmed the elections that were neither free nor fair, and that the human rights violations were indeed massive and systemic. We've taken a variety of actions in support of some of the report's recommendations, including not recognizing the results, calling for new elections under national observation, providing $600,000 in new funding to civil society in Belarus, with a focus on women's leadership and bolstering independent media, and continuing efforts at facilitating dialogue between all actors in Belarus. It is incumbent on the international community to make use of the report and implement recommendations in support of human rights in Belarus. Obviously, this is not obvious, given that the other side, the country in question, also has to come to the table. So there's an obviously complicated situation here. Moreover, as demonstration of our commitment to the dignity and fundamental freedom of the Belarusian people, Canada and the UK were the first to sanction Lukashenko. Altogether, Canada has imposed sanctions on 55 Belarusian officials involved in grave human rights violations. This coordinated action alongside the EU, UK, and US reinforces our assertion that violence and acts that undermine democracy will not be tolerated by the international community. Canada recognizes that the future of Belarus should reflect the will of the citizens. Accordingly, we continue to advocate for an inclusive and genuine national dialogue between the authorities and broader society. And obviously, we support the OSCE's current and incoming chair's offer to facilitate. We are also continuing to engage with programming partners on how Canada's assistance can best support democratic governance and democratic actors. Our foreign minister, Champagne, visited Lithuania in October, and this further reinforced collective support for the people of Belarus and our commitment to ensuring that those responsible for violence and for undermining democracy would be held responsible. Since the start of the crisis, Minister Champagne has been coordinating with his counterparts. He's had multiple calls with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and of course, he has registered Canada's concerns directly with the Belarusian foreign minister. We strongly believe that media freedom remains an essential component of democratic societies, and we are playing a leadership role on this issue. Canada and the UK co-led a joint statement from the Media Freedom Coalition's executive group in September, expressing alarm over the crackdown on journalists and calling on Belarus to guarantee media freedom and accountability on those responsible for limiting the right to freedom of opinion and expression. On November 16, we were pleased to have presented the first ever Canada-UK Media Freedom Award to the Belarusian Association of Journalists. This was done in recognition of their perseverance and self-sacrifice in the face of increased and targeted crackdowns on the media in Belarus. Canada has also been actively engaged multilateral at the OSCE and within the UN system. For example, we co-sponsored a UN Security Council area formula meeting on human rights in Belarus. I hope I'm not talking too fast. I'm trying not to go on forever. I'm aware that you've got other people who want to talk, so just give me a sign if I'm going too fast.
Will do.
Okay, thanks. With 9 other member states, and we presented a Canada-led joint statement on internet shutdowns, which garnered over 30 signatures during the urgent debate at the Human Rights Council in September. Canada has had the pleasure of participating in the interactive dialogue with our friend, the Special Rapporteur at the UN General Assembly in October. And just last week, we took part in a briefing by Professor Benedek at the UN in New York, and also delivered an intervention in a national capacity during the High Commissioner's debate on Belarus in Geneva. These multilateral actions demonstrate Canada's dedication to advancing universal human rights and engaging and calling on Belarus to uphold its international responsibilities and obligations. Moving forward, Canada will continue to stand with our partners in support of human rights for all in Belarus, and will be relentless in calling on the government of Belarus to end all violence and initiate an independent and impartial investigation into the charges, the allegations of violence and torture, which we're seeing every day on social media. It's incredible to be watching this. On a personal note, we don't have representation in Minsk, as you know, but we're very much in touch with the diaspora in Lithuania, in the region. We're in touch with, obviously, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. We're in touch with leaders of the Coordination Council on a regular basis, and of course, with the diplomatic corps in Minsk. We talk regularly to our colleague ambassadors. So we're following events really closely. We're doing what we can. I do want to just say as well that sanctions obviously are important and are being called for. And I know that there are some who are looking at the sanctions rolling out and going, boy, what's taking so long? But I do want to say that if you're going to impose sanctions, you want them to stick. And you want to make sure that you're putting sanctions in place that will stand up in a court of law. And that takes time. So that I did want to just say that. But we are following so closely, and I wanted to say that we're following with a heavy heart because of the abuse that's happening and that we're all observing, but also because of it, with amazement, because of the will of the Belarusian people. And I'm just gobsmacked by everything they're accomplishing peacefully and without stopping. It's unbelievable. So thank you. Merci beaucoup. Achu. Hope I got that right.
Yes, absolutely, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership of Canada in protecting human rights in Belarus and worldwide. And we clearly see that we do need the political will to make sure that international law is functional. We have already 2 questions, and before I raise that to everyone like in the panel, whoever who wants to pick that up, please respond. I will ask the question to the audience for the prizes which were announced. So what's the primary reason why Belarus is not yet at the Council of Europe, though geographically it should be there? So that's the question for the audience. The first 3 who answer that question are going to receive some nice prizes from the organizers. So, and the questions to our panel is like, first question, what could the UN do? We outlined a lot of things which UN does already to lift the spirits of the Belarusian people, the protesters. And the second question is this balance between the right to protect and the non-intervention principle, which is how to make sure that while protecting human rights, we are not interfering, and especially, which is a very complicated case in the authoritarian countries and Belarus in particular. So 2 questions. Who wants to, and we have a couple of more upcoming, so whoever who wants to pick that up, please.
I can't say about UN, but I mean just about inspiring Belarus people. The recent example about Olympic Committee and prohibiting National Olympic Committee representatives to participate and to go anywhere is really inspiring for us. And I mean, maybe it's a little bit nasty to say all this, but I mean, and this is still like, you know, personal sanctions. Sometimes you can't feel it, especially now with COVID, like, you know, these guys can't travel. Okay. But I mean, something like this. And again, still also these personal sanctions to some companies that is really involved is helping us, is giving us hope. And also we know that still some partial justice, they are also not happy today. And this is making at least one day better.
What about the, yeah, please.
I just want to say to that point, the hearts and minds piece, I find that really interesting, because when you're talking to Svetlana, when she says to me, this really matters back home, when these like hockey tournaments and the Olympics, these are things that matter to people. But I also want to say non-interference. Well, this is obviously a complicated geopolitical situation. It's not like someone like NATO is going to walk in. But I do think it's important for those who are just watching social media. There's a whole lot of activity in the back office of people talking to each other, trying to get movement. So it may appear that there's not a lot going on in terms of, you know, going into Belarus and doing something active. I can assure you, and many of you know, of course, but for the general public, they're looking and they're not seeing it, but there's so much going on in behind closed doors to try to get movement. And it's obviously complicated, and in so many ways, it's an incredible thing to watch how peaceful it's staying, because I know there's a high level of frustration among many of the protesters in Belarus, because it seems to be taking forever. But I can't find the words to express how impressive it is to be watching what's happening in Belarus. So well done, I have to say.
So Enira, pass that to all the Belarusians, if you can, that you are inspiring. You are like so, and God, we are trying to lift the spirits as much as we can, and yet there's much to be done. But what about the responsibility to protect? It's a very difficult instrument to launch, and it's basically possible like intervention. And yet I think that before I give the floor to anyone who wants to pick that question up, I do think that human rights, it's not interference to domestic affairs. In fact, these are international obligations by the state. The problem, as the Danish Žalimas mentioned, is that there are like a few institutions that follow that inside Belarus. So we shouldn't be misled by this argument, non-interference into domestic affairs, when we are raising issues of human rights and the rule of law. This is the obligation by the state's institutions. And if they do fail, I think that's the reason why the international institutions are out there. But I'm the political scientist. I don't know, like maybe anyone wants to add to this comment, something more?
Yeah, I can add something. Well, this responsibility to protect, as you know, is not is being challenged by I mean, the French Médecins Sans Frontières launched it at the time, but it's really far from universal. And in fact, when you analyze the responses by the government of Belarus in the UN and of their many friends, again, Russia, China, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, you name them, it's always, they remind of the necessity to avoid double standards. And there is this whataboutism, which reminds us a lot of the Soviet propaganda, you know, like, and there are bombs in New York, you know, people are starving in New York. Well, it's the same thing we're hearing traditionally, that how come you focus on Belarus when in fact there are genocides all through elsewhere on the planet, and when Western countries also crack down on their own protesters at home. This said, regarding the decision of the International Olympic Committee, let me remind that back when there were sanctions, for example, Western sanctions 10 years ago, the fact against officials, including members of the government, the fact that they also happen to all be the president of the national federation for one sport or another, allowed these people who were blacklisted to actually travel to Switzerland, to Lausanne, and on occasion they could even go skiing in Switzerland because they could bypass this visa travel, this travel ban, because they were members also of the International Olympic Committee. So in a way, it's also some lesson learned that, and again, I'm not allowed to have a position on the issue of sanctions, but it's just an illustration that sometimes they can be challenged. They have been challenged at the European Court, but there are ways for those who implement them to make sure they target the people and are more efficient than they used to be in the past. And lastly, about the Council of Europe, the fact that there is a standing invitation, but in fact Belarus is not a member, is because the Parliamentary Assembly makes it a condition for extending an invitation that the death penalty be abolished, or that at least a moratorium on executions be adopted. And this has been a call of the international community for several decades, but in spite of the government's announcements that they would consider this eventually, well, nothing has happened so far. So indeed, Belarus is out for now.
I think that there were two answers and there are three prizes. So the third prize goes to Anaïs, I think, or whoever who follows what she said. But Professor Benedek wanted to do us a hand, right, Professor? Your mic.
I also need to switch on my mic. So thank you very much. Yes, you know, I'm an international lawyer by training, and therefore I find it always intriguing when I listen to these discussions on non-interference. We had this in the debate in the Permanent Council of the OSCE in response to my report. And we had a similar discussion in a side event in New York, which was organized by the Austrian delegation and a number of others, where the Russian delegate and Belarusian as well, and some others came up with this principle of national sovereignty and non-interference. Now, this reminds me of the international law approach of Soviet Union and its friends until the end of the Cold War. This was exactly the language which was used at that time and what you could read in textbooks and so on. But then, after the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union turned into the Russian Federation. It became a member of the Council of Europe. CSC went into OSCE and so on with all the commitments. And the Moscow Mechanism was adopted in Moscow in 1991. So a new world started on different principles. And one of these principles is that you have a right to be concerned about the human rights situation in other countries. That is also even an obligation within an organization which has common principles, among them human rights and democracy. And when you refer to the responsibility to protect, where maybe our Canadian ambassador could also say something on it, because this was a strong issue for the Canadians for some time. The responsibility to protect has been misused a bit, and in Libya in particular, and it is often connected with military intervention. Therefore, one has to be careful. But when we look at the General Assembly resolution of 2005, where it was endorsed, the responsibility to protect does exist as a principle of United Nations. However, it has the precondition that you have to go through the procedure of United Nations. And that means in the end, you need the Security Council. So that is a dead end in the sense when you have veto powers against you. And therefore, I would not expect much from this, except that you can mention it as a principle. But we do not need that principle because in international humanitarian law, human rights law, we have anyway the principle that we have a right to be concerned about the human rights situation in other countries, whether they are neighboring countries or anywhere else in the world.
Thank you. Indeed, I think that we could talk for another hour or so, and yet our time is running up. I think that there's another question, which is what are the international mechanisms like which could be added to the international investigation? And yet I think that throughout the discussion, we touched upon many things. Dainius Žalimas mentioned tribunals, ad hoc, and different kind of forms, which in my opinion, require, first of all, political will and our determination. The argument that it's not in the playbook, it's not in the playbook yet. You know, some of the things might be invented. That's why the international institutions are there, and not forbidden. And if it's not forbidden, then it actually might be created. So, I mean, we need to be creative. We need to have this out-of-the-box thinking as well. But first of all, we need a strong political will. And when it comes to the states, we already mentioned a number of international mechanisms which are out there, which were already in place, launched. And I think it shows the commitment to what is happening to democracy and human rights in Belarus. On the personal level, individually, I think that every ambassador, every politician, every official can be, and every human being can be vocal and not ignorant to what is happening in Belarus. If you want, you can always write a postcard to the political prisoners. There are a number of addresses and ways how to do it. A number of political prisoners in Belarus. Believe me, I've heard not from even one political prisoner that when they are receiving the postcards, it made their day, not even a day, but actually a week. You can contribute, donate financially to various initiatives which are helping oppressed people, be it by help, be it by soul. There are multiple initiatives, crowdfunded platforms. You can tweet about this particular discussion or other discussions or things that you are observing in Belarus. Publicity is also very, very important to make sure that we do not end up as we ended up in 2011, when Belarus was in agenda for a couple of weeks, and then Arab Spring happened and Belarus simply shaded away. I hope that we are not getting into that vicious circle again when the Belarusian regime is selling one by one the political prisoner, and then some of the countries start perceiving that this is a start of some sort of dialogue. And I'm sure if this particular panel was a decision-making body in terms how to make the international law work and contribute to the change in Belarus, protecting human rights and democracy, they would do, international mechanisms would be much more effective. And yet, we see that the international community has already paid quite a lot of attention, and after all, everything is up to the Belarusian people, who are fascinating and very inspiring. Thank you for the inspiring discussion. I hope that next year we will be able to organize this in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.